The pyramids are a complicated situation. How they built, let me touch on just a couple of things. How they built the pyramids, I'm not going to tell you how they built the pyramids because I don't know. I've talked to a lot of engineers. I'm a geologist myself. I have some sense of, moving around big blocks and cutting them out, etc. So when you're talking about Aswan granite that was brought from the south, and you're talking about the King's Chamber and the relief chambers above, which I've been in several times, very few people have actually been up there. It's amazing how many people will express strong opinions about things they've never actually seen personally. But you've got, 70, 90-ton blocks of granite up there. How they did that, I'm not going to try to guess at this point. I've read all of the theories. I find none of them particularly convincing. When you look at the Sphinx Temple, and I'm using this ties in with the pyramids and how they built the pyramids, there you've got 50 to 100-ton blocks of limestone that were quarried out, cut out from around the body of the Sphinx and moved not super far, admittedly, but move a 50-ton to 100-ton block and position it into place to build the Sphinx Temple. The Sphinx Temple, to me, is much more engineering feat than the core body of the Sphinx. And the Sphinx Temple goes back to the same time as the body of the Sphinx. So we're talking end of the last ice age. And when you are there in person, Egyptologists can say, oh, they used hundreds of people and levers, or maybe thousands of people. You can't get them in that tight confines. I mean, it's a very narrow, very small area. When you actually are walking around in the Sphinx Temple, which I've done a number of times, but it's not actually open to the general public. So a lot of times, again, people, until you're really there and feel it and understand it, it's hard to comprehend, and it's much easier than to make up these wild theories. So there's a whole issue of how they were built, when they were built. Let me address when they were built. There is no doubt in my mind that the pyramids in particular, the pyramids specifically, were rebuilt, refurbished in dynastic times, in Old Kingdom times. I know this, I believe this is the case. When I say I know, I'm really saying, based on the evidence, I conclude this.
Yeah.
Based on a number of lines of evidence. One, just as an analogy, there's no doubt the Sphinx was being worked on and refurbished at that time, and the head was being recarved sometime in dynastic times. But more importantly, when you look at the pyramid, especially the second pyramid, which may actually have its origins before the first pyramid, although the traditional views it came Great Pyramid, Second Pyramid, or the Pyramid of Khufu, the traditional rulers who are associated with them, Khufu, Khafre, and then Menkaure, or Mycerinus. People use different, the Greek version versus, I'll call it pseudo-Egyptian version, since we don't know exactly how Egyptians pronounced the names back then. If you look at the second pyramid, you can see that part of it is carved out of the bedrock on the plateau. And you also, and many people pay no attention to this or don't even realize that they can walk all around it and visit Egypt. If no one points out, they don't see it. It is ringed by granite at the base. There's actually a ring of granite, red Aswan granite, around the base that was placed there before the current, most of which are removed, limestone blocks above it. So you have to essentially imagine this pyramid with this ring of red around the base. That is super significant in my assessment, and I learned this long ago because I was with some Egyptologists in Egypt, in some of the tombs, and I was going through this tomb, and there was this tomb where there was sort of this speckly at the base of the tomb, or on the walls of the tomb, sort of the lowest meter of the tomb. it was sort of like this speckly reddish, like they had dabbed red all over the place. And some Egyptologists saying he has no clue what they're going on. It's like sloppy work. I said, no, I recognize as a geologist right away, that's pseudo granite, faux granite. And then it clicked. And he said, well, yeah, often when they were restoring things, they would use granite, or they would use a touch of granite to show that they were restoring it. And I think that's exactly what we have on the second pyramid, that they are showing that they were taking an older structure in dynastic times and restoring it, refurbishing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then you start looking at the structure. When I look at with my eyes as a geologist, I can start to pick out, and I haven't, this is a big project, but you can start to, at least I'm convinced I can start to pick out where the older portions are underneath some of the removed stone and where new stone has been added, etc. Now, when you talk about the Great Pyramid, I am convinced, and I do talk about this in my earlier book, Pyramid Quest, I'm convinced at one point it was only built purposefully up to about the 50th layer. So that is below where the king's chamber is. And it's basically at the level of the top of the grand gallery. That's the area I'm talking about. And it was used for, I'm convinced, astronomical purposes, among other things. Astronomical, which would have been astrological also for the ancient Egyptians. And the grand gallery, if it were open to the sky, as I believe it was open to the sky at some point, would make a perfect astronomical instrument for very, very, very fine measurements of celestial objects in the sky. It points out to the sky, and remember that the stars are moving over time, rise in the east and set in the west every day. The planets are moving relative to the stars and whatnot. So you don't move your instrument around. You let the stars move around across the field of view of the instrument, and you can take measurements. And this goes back to classic astronomy, where you use things, minutes, hours, minutes, seconds, etc. We still have degrees that are divided into that. Well, that's because they were keeping track of time. They were keeping track of the movements as they were going by a fixed coordinate. So I don't want to digress on that too much, but there's evidence that that was certainly the case, I believe, before dynastic times, by the way.
But that means that the alignment with Orion, the Orion's belt, that I think you and Robert Bauval and others have.
That
was a later thing then.
That was later. That's a later. So I'm going back even further. I believe that the pit, or the subterranean chamber, probably goes back even further in time, maybe to Sphinx time, etc. And something else that's very interesting that Katie, again, my wife, and I often talk about is that there is evidence, and I talk about this in the book, and I think you're aware of this, of vitrification of the Giza Plateau actually being hit by a solar outburst. All the evidence you expect, and that the sun basically touched down, the finger of the sun, if you would, touch the Giza Plateau. And I think there's a very strong case, or it's a very good hypothesis, that where the Great Pyramid stands, the second pyramid, the third pyramid, these are places where it touched down, it hit. When you have a solar outburst like that, major solar outburst, you have vitrification, you have, in some cases, plasma. It's called plasma, electrically charged particles moving at incredible speeds. In this case, could penetrate the atmosphere. And this was talked about very early on in the 1960s by a very famous astrophysicist, Thomas Gold, and other astrophysicists have now confirmed that this, yes, can happen with stars like the sun. The sun is just another star. I want to, before I forget, because there's so much that I could talk about.
I know,
I forget, this ties in with the Sphinx, the water weathering on the Sphinx. Because when you have these conditions, you melt glaciers, you evaporate water from oceans and from land, etc. You put all this moisture into the atmosphere. It has to go somewhere again. So then you end up with torrential rains. Even with our little bit of global warming today, we're seeing this where you have torrential rains and flooding and whatnot. So you have the evidence right in the plateau. You have the inventory stela that talks about the Sphinx having been hit by lightning, quote unquote, or thunderbolt, quote unquote, in ancient times, well before dynastic times. And the pharaoh Khufu, who supposedly constructed the Great Pyramid, well, I think he reconstructed it, or he reappropriated it to himself, but he went to the Sphinx to see the thunderbolt, which I interpreted as vitrification that's preserved on the plateau. And I also need to, before I forget, I've been up in the relieving chambers that have the cartouches of Khufu. And there's two things about them. Yes, I believe they are ancient. I have no doubt that they are genuinely ancient, but they're probably 4th dynasty, and they probably have to do with refurbishments and repairs to the pyramid at that time, not the origin of the monument. That would be my quick summary of that. So when I look at it, I see the major extinctions of large mammals occurred at the end of the last ice age, the end of the Younger Dryas. And why large mammals? This doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily, or isn't easily explained with a comet, but it makes a lot of sense with a solar outburst, because what you have are, among other things, these torrential rains, high radiation levels. It's been calculated by a physicist whom I know that you would have such high level radiation at low for short periods of time on the surface that just a few days of exposure could be lethal. And we see this huge die-off of large mammals at the end of the last ice age, circa 9700 BCE, including humans, frankly, dying off in many areas. And how do you escape this? The best way to escape is to go under rocks, to go underground, to go into caves and shelters. And what do we see at the end of the last ice age? We see that people were doing just that, where they survived. So I'm convinced a pocket of humanity survived in Anatolia, modern Turkey.
Cappadocia is called, I think.
The Cappadocia region, which is where you have all these huge underground cities. Now, some of those cities may have been elaborated and used later. This is typical of ancient structures, that they get used and reused and reused. But what's the origin of them? I believe it was because of the devastating events at the end of the last ice age. And the rock there is really well suited to carve into quickly. I think it started with natural caves, and they carved into it, and they would have had to go underground during the major events, and then they could come up to the surface again, then come back. And also, I want to point out that there was probably a major solar outburst at the end of the last ice age, 9700 BCE, but there were probably, sort of more minor ones for up to a couple of thousand years. The analogy I often use, which I think people can grasp and hold on to, is when you have a major earthquake, you have a bunch of aftershocks afterwards.
Oh, yeah.
Same with a solar outburst. So you've got these ancient underground complexes where humans, who are large mammals, could survive. But, a lot of other large mammals, other than bears, who go into caves anyway, they didn't survive. They couldn't cope with the situation. So, in more southern latitudes, maybe, but even then it was very problematic, etc. What survives other than humans are a lot of smaller animals. So they could go into coveys, they can go naturally into burrows and that type of thing. So you've got that type of biological evidence, which, again, I'm mentioning very briefly, but
during that time on the surface, there were large, vast wildfires and flooding, and
there would have been wildfires, flooding, but more than anything else, I think high radiation levels.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, high radiation levels because you've damaged the ozone layer. You maybe wiped it out completely. So very impactful. You ultraviolet, and also because of protons and other particles at relativistic or ultra relativistic. Very close to good percentage of the speed of light coming down. That's going to cause essentially radioisotopes and high radiation levels, etc. So yeah, it was pretty devastating. It was pretty difficult, and they didn't necessarily understand. Other than that, they needed to. Yeah, they didn't necessarily understand in terms of our modern science. I actually think they understood a lot more than we give them credit for.
Yeah.
But they realized that they had to seek shelter. And also, I want to point out, because I have all these critics saying, "Oh, these underground cities, they're only a few thousand years old, et cetera, et cetera." I'm a geologist. When you're talking about underground cities, that in some cases could hold 10,000 people, and that's standard archaeologists saying that. So these are really huge complexes. When you see what they excavated out, where did all that rock and debris go? It had to be brought to the surface. You don't find the huge piles of it now. Well, that's
No,
because
why? Why is that?
there are thousands of that was done thousands and thousands of years ago, and it's eroded. It's
Oh yeah,
basically
that's evidence that it's much older than they say. I
much
see.
older.
Yeah.
If it were, I will say, as a geologist, if there are only 2,000 to 3,000 or even 4,000 years old, you would still find at least some of that debris piled up. Furthermore, not to belabor this too much, one of the standard archaeological explanations is they did this to escape their enemies. So the marauding hordes, somehow they built these underground cities and they could close themselves in and escape their enemies. Well, to me, that would be a death trap. When you start looking at some of these forts and you look at the archaeological evidence, yeah, their origins go back, as far as can be confirmed for some of them, back to the end of the last ice age, back to that much earlier period. They were simply reused, readopted at a later time. And this gets into a more general theme that I've been exploring, and Katie and I have been really exploring in detail, which is that a lot of things may have been misdated by standard archaeologists. Just like the Sphinx has been misstated, in my opinion. It was being used 4,500 years ago, but that doesn't mean the origins go back to that period. And when you go to Egypt, I show people, when I take them to Egypt, we look at all kinds of statues where you can see in dynastic times that pharaohs would put their name on something.
Yeah.
And it's quite evident they were putting their name on something that was older. In some cases, not only did they put their name on something, but the next pharaoh came along, took out that name, put their name on it. In some cases, a third pharaoh came along. So they would reappropriate, they would reuse structures. And that gets back to what we were talking about with the pyramids, with the Sphinx. And I think we're finding that more and more around the world. And to me, it ties in quite logically that you had an earlier period of civilization, an earlier cycle of civilization, as I refer to it, ending at the end of the last ice age with the cataclysms there. And then when civilization reemerged, yeah, they did readopt some of the structures that they found, or some of the remains, just as happened at the during the Dark Ages, European Dark Ages.
But this was the true Dark Age that you are talking about now. I mean, 9,700 BCE, as you describe it here, at the end of the Younger Dryas, the solar-induced Dark Age ensued.
Solar-induced
that lasted for how many thousands of years?
6,000 years or so, approximately 6,000 years. So that was much more devastating. I just used the Dark Ages in Europe with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, because people can relate.
Yeah, that was a walk in the park compared to this.
That was a walk in the park, exactly. And also you have to remember that the Dark Ages in Europe were not the Dark Ages elsewhere. It was actually a flowering, for instance, of Islam, and so much of what we know Aristotle, etc. It's because it was preserved in the Middle East, in the Far East. So it was not an overall dark age globally. Solar-induced dark age, 9,700 BC to about, let's say, till 3,700 BC, when you start to reemerge. That would be a nice, I'm just using those numbers to give a nice 6,000 years, but somewhere between 4,000, 3,000 BC, that was global. That, I'm convinced, was global. That was not a local dark age. That really was devastating at 9,700 BC. Everywhere, I'm convinced so far, based on the evidence, everywhere you start to see a flowering of civilization, an early cycle of civilization. I've been to India, but India has been reused and rebuilt so much, it's very difficult to know where some of these the temples, where their origins are physically, but certainly the traditions suggest that there was a much earlier flowering of civilization. When you talk about India and Hindu traditions, etc., there's where you have the Yuga cycle, the concept that, yes, there were earlier civilizations. I mean, this has been their tradition in modern times. And I'm talking as a geologist, modern times, the last 5,000 years. That's been their tradition, that there was a much earlier cycle of civilization. And most Westerners have dismissed this. Oh, these are nice myths. These are nice religious, philosophical beliefs. No, I think they knew exactly what they were talking about. Just like I think the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago, approximately, in the earliest Old Kingdom, they were talking about Septepi. From the book, Septepi, and that was the tradition that there was an earlier civilization, an earlier, very advanced civilization that they were building upon. And so many people,
And in South America, you have the Mayan tradition, and
Mayans, sure. So you get these traditions around the world. Michael Witzel, who is emeritus at Harvard University. I've spoken to him about this. He'll, in person, and he wrote a book. What's it called? On the Origins of the World's Mythologies. And it's a very technical book, et cetera, et cetera. But he talks about this too, how you have these traditions around the world, and they go back to the end of the last ice age. He talks about that.